So these are the issues. So when you get nothing, what can you do?
Okay.
Putin has already won all African.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, we'll take a short break. When we come back, Plus Politics continues. Stay with us.
With regards to the electoral laws, well, I do not care too much about those laws as much as I care about the human resources that are going to conduct elections. And INEC, as it is presently composed, is made up of people who do not have the credibility to conduct free and fair elections. I'm not interested in zoning. I hope that Nigeria would continue to search for competent Nigerians who can run this country effectively, efficiently, in a just and egalitarian manner, so that these ethnic jingoists will not have a say in how we run our lives. We have done this whole rotational presidency for 20 years now. We've taken the presidency, Nigeria has taken the ruling class has taken the presidency to as many places as possible. But what they have not taken the presidency to is the zone of competency, zone of justice, zone of men of integrity. So if we make the mistake again of zoning to another incompetent character simply because of the location of his village, well, we will regret it.
So we are saying that what obtained about 60 years ago cannot confidently obtain now. So with respect to grazing routes, as a matter of fact, we're in a modern civilization. Modern civilization does not really give room for somebody taking cattle from the north down to the Port. Efforts must be made. These boys that are taking these cattle, they should go to school. In fact, when you look at pastoral nomadism, it's one that took place about 100, 200 years ago. There's no civilized world today you find people following cattle.
There's a great deal of reform required in the national security sector, especially with the police. I don't see any serious reforms going on. Where I would have said maybe a lot of money is going on into training, this, that, and so on. No. In nearly every state, where today we have the military complementing the effort of the police on ground, we know how much state governments are spending. And that is why some of the governors are saying, allow us to have our own police force. And then this money, or this entire monies we are pumping in at the various state levels, will go into our own police. The federal government could lay out the guidelines. We're not saying give them a free hand. Our politicians are not as mature as that. Governors, they are like children. They are like little kids with children.
These are shying away from rotation of power because in less than, 1 year to the polls, none of the parties, to the best of my knowledge, have come out to say we are picking our candidate, or this is the particular region where we'll be having our presidential candidate come from, whether it is the APC, the PDP, and all other smaller parties. None of the parties are doing that, are saying that at the moment. So I think it is actually wrong for the the governor of Ondo State, to categorically say that if any party feels a northerner, the southerners won't support. And I must say this: you see, democracy, whether we like it or not, is a government of numbers, is a product of numbers. I mean to say, and the fact is that the northern part of Nigeria still holds sway in terms of voters' power. So it holds on any candidate, whether it's coming, the candidate, particularly candidates coming from the south, to romance excuse my word, to romance the North. Like what have Tinubu doing at the moment, for every little thing here and there in the North. He was in Zamfara before he traveled to London and so on. And even the vice president, whether he has declared or not, but you see him romanticizing the North. He was in Kano State for a public lecture 2 days ago, but he used the opportunity to visit the family of Hanifa that was murdered some weeks back. So I think it is very important that any candidate, particularly that wants to win the presidential election, must embrace the North.
I will score the president 70% in the fight against corruption. You see, fighting corruption is not a tea party. It's a difficult task for anybody in any country of the world, no matter how powerful, no matter how developed the countries are. Corruption can be very tricky when it comes to avoiding the long arm of the law. And you also know that corruption crimes are not committed in the open. And that means that a lot of efforts will have to be put in place to trace the evidence of corruption.
I must tell you that originally and for some time, I've always believed in competency as opposed to zoning. In other words, let's look for somebody who is able to deliver the goods. But in recent times, as a result of so many acts of injustice in the land and a lot of agitation in the land, I'm beginning to think, seriously speaking, that might appear to be one of the ways to address the tension in the country presently. Let me confess to you that while I was the National Legal Advisor of the party and a member of the National Working Committee and the Executive Council of that party, the president had always resisted invitation to be domineering in terms of party affairs as much as possible. But as since progresses, you discover that gradually people, in my view, are gradually bringing all pressure on him to take charge of the party. In other words, submitting the entire party to the president. And I think that led to what happened eventually in dismantling the earlier structure.
The reason why we seem to have insecurity all around the country and the reason why they are escalating is because certain persons in government and out of government are benefiting immensely. These people are the people we call conflict entrepreneurs. They make a lot of cash, a lot of capital out of conflict. So these are the individuals that are actually stoking up the violence in the Southeast particularly. And what we said is that it is the duty of the political elites from the Southeast region, because there are quite a number of people in government from that region of the country. They have not really done sufficient, they've not really shown sufficient commitments. The insecurity you have in the Southeast, basically, as we said, insecurity is being instigated by elements embedded in the federal government.
There was no reason for the suspension or the ban to have been imposed in the first place. As I have consistently maintained, it was a decision that was not warranted. It was a decision that was taken in bad faith. It was a decision that was taken on account of vengeance, in pursuance of vendetta, by a regime that felt slighted, by what was rightfully perceived by a large section of the population as a genocidal and irresponsible tweet by the president was deleted. That accounted for the so-called ban that the government imposed. So eventually, the government had to reverse the abnormality that they had forced on the country. Those who participated in the atrocities that are being committed against Nigerians, the draconian measures, the high-handedness, the party that is complicit, the political party and the political actors who are complicit in these things that have happened, who have endorsed these things, who have been silent on the impunity of this regime, must be punished in the next election. Nigerians must, and that's the point I made on Twitter. I said, look, as citizens, we must imbibe the culture of punishing politicians and political parties that inflict pains on us. The reason why people go into offices and do whatever they like is because of the absence of the policy of consequence. They know nothing will happen. They know they will still be voted for. They will know they will still have people rally for them. So when they do these things that they know that they will pay a heavy price, people become circumspect. People begin to think before they act.
I advocated sometimes that Nigeria should have to go to training to understand the real meaning of federalism. You know, we are not federal with.
The Senate has approved financial autonomy for state legislators, judiciary and local governments in the country. Now, this was revealed during House voting sessions on the report of the Senate Committee on the Review of the 1999 Constitution, the fifth alteration bills of 2022. Now, senators during the voting on the report, however, rejected pension for presiding officers of the legislature. Well, joining us to discuss this is the former Director General of NIMASA, Dr. Dakuku Adol-Peterside. It's good to have you join us.
Good evening, and thank you. One, guarantee the existence of local government by democratic means, meaning having democratic elected officials run local government. Nigerians to date have not optimized the benefit of that provision of the Constitution, and there are a lot of reasons for it. One of the reasons is the fact that when you give people responsibility, you must also give them resources. And there's a specific provision of responsibilities for the local government without corresponding resources. Now, whereas by the Constitution, there's a provision of allocation for local governments, but in practical experience, in practical terms, local governments don't get these resources. And because they don't get resources, the people are not able to hold them accountable. The people are not able to hold them responsible to drive development at the grassroots. The people are not able to hold them responsible for provision of services as enshrined or as provided for in the Constitution and in relevant provisions of the Constitution. So you now have given them responsibility without corresponding resources. And in addition to lack of provision of resources, we have also observed over time that local governments are being strangulated by various state governments, and it comes in diverse ways. One is that through the joint state local government account, money will obviously not get to local governments. There are cases too where states force local governments on the projects to execute. And so those projects are not the priorities of the people. The state is far from the people, so they don't understand what the priorities of the people are. That's a great concern. Now, the third is that we've also had experience where various states House of Assembly emasculate the third tier of government. In fact, in many places, there are no democratically elected government at the third tier level. Governors perpetuate themselves by appointing, sometimes you call them caretaker committees, sometimes you call them by whatever name.
But these so-called caretaker committees or appendages to state governments in the guise of local governments didn't really start until recently. I mean, I'm saying this from experience. Let's say some early 1999, local governments were really working. You could see local governments doing what they ought to do in a sense. But then down the line, we started seeing local government elections becoming a sham of sorts. And I mean, you know these things more than I do, but I'm saying I have seen local governments work before now, but now we hardly see them. We see governors, like you said, create caretaker committees, elections don't hold. And the people who need government the most really don't know where to go to, because if you go to your local government chairman or the man who's representing you as a councillor and he's unable to help you, how do you get to the governor?
All right, let me take it from another perspective, or a historical perspective. In 1999, it is very possible that we had democratically elected local governments in place because it was a transition year from the military to civilian administrators or civilian governments in place. But immediately after 1999, we started having, whether you call them caretaker committees, call them interim government, by whatever name so-called. So it didn't start recently. From 2003, we started experiencing all forms of aberration in local government administration. And I recall clearly, I had served as local government chairman before, I recall clearly that a few of our colleagues, as early as 2002, had started complaining that state governments were tampering with their funds. They didn't have access to their allocation. They were actually determining projects for them and forcing them to do joint projects that were not part of their priorities, and they didn't even have budgets. In some cases, budgets were being forced on them. State houses of assembly, and in some states, most states, the state house of assembly approves budgets, whereas it should be the responsibility of local government council with elected councillors. So we've had this over time. Acknowledge the fact that when President Olusegun Obasanjo was in office, he made attempts, to correct this abnormally. It didn't quite succeed because it's a tedious process to amend the Constitution. And the past 4 times that there was an attempt to amend the Constitution, in all cases, there was an attempt to amend that provision that provide for fiscal autonomy for local governments. And in all 4 occasions, it failed. Because as you progress from the State House of Assembly to progress from National Assembly to various state houses of assembly, the governors, in ways I cannot explain, they always have a way of having control of the state house of assemblies. Will get the
Isn't that obvious? I mean, isn't that a practice in Nigeria where if the government of the day is, for example, the APC, then the rubber stamp legislature follows?
Well,
isn't that a practice? It
is a practice. It's not right. It doesn't make it right. And so that's where we are. So, it's got historical antecedent. And I hope that this particular attempt will succeed. It's my prayer. I'm optimistic that this attempt succeeds so that at least we can free the local governments, empower them actually to provide services and hold them responsible and accountable for resources allocated to local governments.
It's interesting that, again, I like to use the term people who need government the most, who are at the grassroots. That should be the priority of these lawmakers, but that isn't the case. So I'm wondering, does it have to do with how we're practicing the form of government that we say we're practicing? Of course, it's a unitary form of government, but we call it a federalism. Does that also play a role in why things are a bit skewed as it is? And why are governments so adamant on giving these people their opportunity to govern at those levels? Because those levels of government are suffering, and the people who are living in those local government areas also.
There are 3 reasons for it. Now, the problem is not as much of the people. If you notice, you may have observed that in the political process, I don't think very often it is governors or some very members of some very powerful political elite that will literally handpick those who will run on the platform of various political parties. So these guys come with a mentality that they're not representing the people, they are representing whatever interest that forced them on the ticket of the political party. Now, of course, they provide resources, they get elected, and they know that primarily they're not representing the people.
So the sense of service is lost in all of this. In all of this. So,
of course.
So the fear that many, because we did a little poll on social media to find out if governors would adhere, because again, this is not necessarily a state government problem, and I'm talking about adherence to law. We've had several disobedience to laws in this country at all levels. What's the guarantee that governors would adhere to this particular move by the National Assembly?
That concurrently, 2/3 of the State House of Assembly will have to concur with the National Assembly before it becomes part of the Constitution, becomes the law. Now, if eventually it becomes the law, I don't see state governments disobeying the provisions of the Constitution. Of course, it can be challenged in court, and there are other measures to ensure that they can't afford to flaunt the law. The first step is that it means there will be no more state, local, sustainable way.
Hope that in the next few
from Independent National Electoral Commission. So it will still be under the purview of various state governments. And that's why if you notice a case for proper